The rain arrived without warning on the day of the funeral, not gentle or cleansing, but cold and relentless, drumming against the roof of Sarah Mitchell's car with a rhythm that matched the hollow ache in her chest. She sat in the parking lot of St. Mary's Church, watching water streak down the windshield in uneven patterns, blurring the world outside into shapes that felt easier to manage than the reality waiting inside those stone walls. Her grandmother was gone. Eleanor Mitchell, the woman who had raised her after Sarah's parents died in that highway accident 15 years ago. The woman whose voice could turn any ordinary afternoon into something worth remembering, whose hands had held Sarah through every nightmare and celebrated every small victory, was now reduced to a polished wooden box and a collection of memories that Sarah wasn't ready to face alone. She glanced at the passenger seat, where her daughter, Emma, sat bundled in a jacket too thin for the weather, earbuds in, eyes fixed on her phone. 9 years old and already building walls between herself and the world. Sarah couldn't blame her. Life had taught Emma early that security was temporary and comfort was a luxury they couldn't always afford. "We should go in," Sarah said quietly, though her voice barely rose above the rain's percussion. Emma didn't respond at first, didn't even look up. Then, with the careful reluctance of a child who had learned to expect disappointment, she pulled out one earbud and nodded. No words, just resignation. They walked through the rain together, Sarah's hand on Emma's small shoulder, both of them moving toward the heavy church doors like soldiers marching toward an inevitable defeat. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and old wood, of grief disguised as ceremony. The pews were sparsely filled, mostly with Eleanor's church friends, women in dark dresses who dabbed at their eyes with crumpled tissues, and a handful of distant relatives Sarah barely recognized. At the front, beside the closed casket draped in white lilies, stood Victor Mitchell, Sarah's uncle. Even from the back of the church, she could see him, tall and imposing in his expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money or consequences. He was Eleanor's only son, the golden child who had made his fortune in real estate development and never let anyone forget it. And Sarah had always known Victor resented her presence in Eleanor's life. To him, Sarah was the interloper, the orphaned niece who had stolen his mother's attention and resources during the years when he was too busy building his empire to visit. Now, as Sarah and Emma slipped into a pew near the back, she felt his gaze find her across the room, cold and assessing, like a predator measuring prey. The service passed in a blur of hymns and readings, words about grace and eternal rest that felt hollow against the weight of loss. Sarah held Emma's hand throughout, squeezing gently whenever the little girl's breath hitched with suppressed tears. When it ended, when the final prayer had been spoken and the mourners began filing out into the rain, Victor approached them with the practiced sympathy of someone performing a role. "Sarah," he said, so his voice smooth as silk and just as empty. "I'm glad you could make it. I know Eleanor would have wanted you here." "Of course I'm here," Sarah replied, hearing the edge in her own voice. "She was my grandmother." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, well, we'll need to discuss the estate. There are matters to settle. Perhaps you could come by the house tomorrow. Say, 10 o'clock. Sarah's stomach tightened. She knew what this meant. Eleanor's house, the small Victorian on Maple Street where Sarah had grown up, where every room held fragments of her childhood, would now be carved up and distributed according to whatever will Eleanor had left behind. And knowing Victor, he would ensure he received the lion's share. "I'll be there," Sarah said quietly. Victor nodded, his gaze flicking dismissively to Emma before he turned away, now already moving toward a cluster of well-dressed relatives who looked more interested in networking than mourning. That night, in the cramped one-bedroom apartment Sarah and Emma called home, sleep refused to come. Sarah lay on the pull-out couch, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to Emma's soft breathing from the bedroom. The apartment was small, barely 700 square feet, with thin walls that let in every sound from the neighbors, and a kitchen where the refrigerator hummed too loudly and the stove worked only half the time. They had lived here for 3 years, ever since Sarah's ex-husband Marcus had walked out, taking with him not just his presence, but most of their savings and any illusion of stability. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Marcus had fought for nothing except his freedom, not leaving Sarah with full custody of Emma and a pile of debt that still woke her up at night with anxiety clawing at her chest. She worked 2 jobs now, morning shifts at the county hospital as a medical records clerk, and evening shifts 3 times a week at a diner called Betty's, slinging coffee and burgers to truckers and late-night regulars who tipped in singles when they tipped at all. The money barely covered rent, groceries, and Emma's school supplies. There was never enough left over for savings, for emergencies, for the kind of security that let you sleep without fear of eviction notices or past due bills. Eleanor had helped when she could, slipping Sarah cash in envelopes marked "just because," or showing up with groceries and a smile that pretended the charity was really just a visit. But Eleanor's pension had been modest, and her health had declined sharply in the past year, medical bills eating away at whatever small nest egg she'd managed to save. Now she was gone, and Sarah felt the absence like a wound that wouldn't close. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the rain having softened into a drizzle that clung to everything like sorrow. Sarah dropped Emma off at school, watching her daughter walk toward the building with hunched shoulders and a backpack too heavy for her small frame, and then drove across town to Eleanor's house. The Victorian stood at the end of Maple Street, its paint faded, but still holding traces of the pale yellow Eleanor had chosen decades ago. The porch sagged slightly, and the garden that had once bloomed with roses and hydrangeas now looked overgrown and neglected. Sarah's throat tightened as she parked and made her way up the front steps, each creak of wood beneath her feet, a reminder of afternoons spent reading on this porch, of lemonade and laughter, and a time when the world had felt safer. Inside, the house smelled the way it always had, of lavender and old books, of cinnamon from the candles Eleanor loved, and something deeper, something that was just Eleanor's presence woven into the walls. Victor was already there, standing in the living room with a lawyer, a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses who held a leather briefcase like a shield. "Ah, Sarah," Victor said, his tone brisk. "Good. We can get started." They sat in Eleanor's favorite room, the small parlor with its floral wallpaper and the antique clock that had long since stopped working. The lawyer, Mr. Harrington, now opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents, his expression carefully neutral. "This is Eleanor Mitchell's last will and testament," he began, his voice dry and precise. "It's straightforward. The house, along with the majority of the estate, has been left to Victor Mitchell." Sarah's heart sank, though she had expected this. Victor was the son, the blood heir. Of course, Eleanor would leave him the house. Mr. Harrington continued. "However, there are specific bequests for Sarah Mitchell." He glanced at her, and something in his expression softened slightly. "Eleanor wanted you to have several personal items. First, the contents of her bedroom closet, specifically her clothing and jewelry box. Second, the collection of books from the upstairs study. And third, a music box that Eleanor kept on her dresser." Sarah blinked. "Are you surprised?" The music box. She remembered it, a small wooden thing with intricate carvings, something Eleanor had cherished but never explained. It had always sat on the dresser, untouched, almost forgotten. "That's it?" Victor's voice cut through the moment, sharp and incredulous. "A music box and some old books." Mr. Harrington met his gaze evenly. "Those were Eleanor's wishes." Victor laughed, a sound without humor. "Well, Sarah, I hope you enjoy your inheritance. Maybe you can sell the books at a yard sale." The words stung, but Sarah kept her face neutral. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. After the meeting, after Victor had left with Mr. Harrington to discuss the logistics of selling the house, Sarah walked upstairs alone. Eleanor's bedroom was exactly as she remembered, the floral quilt neatly made, and the dresser cluttered with framed photographs and small trinkets. And there, sitting in the same spot it had occupied, for as long as Sarah could remember, was the music box. She picked it up carefully, surprised by its weight. It was heavier than it looked, the wood dark and polished, the carvings on its surface depicting vines and flowers in intricate detail. She tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. There was no visible lock, no keyhole, just smooth wood and stubborn resistance. Sarah turned it over in her hands, studying it. Why had Eleanor left her this? What significance did it hold? She didn't have answers, but she wrapped the music box in a soft cloth and placed it carefully in her bag. She spent the next hour gathering the books from the study, filling boxes with volumes of poetry and history, novels Eleanor had loved, and a few leather-bound journals filled with her grandmother's neat handwriting. Then she loaded everything into her car and drove back to the apartment, the music box sitting on the passenger seat like a question waiting to be answered. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table with the music box in front of her. She tried again to open it, pressing and pulling at various spots, but it remained sealed. Frustration bubbled up inside her, mingling with grief and exhaustion. This was her inheritance, a locked box she couldn't open and a pile of old books she couldn't afford to keep. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister-in-law, Linda, Marcus's sister, who still kept in touch despite the divorce. "Heard about the will? Victor's telling everyone you got basically nothing. I'm sorry, Sarah. That's rough." Sarah stared at the message, her jaw tightening. Of course, Victor was already spreading the story, painting her as the poor relation who had been left scraps. She could imagine the conversations, the barely concealed pity mixed with smug satisfaction. Another text followed. "He's also saying you're probably going to try to contest it. Just a heads up." Sarah set the phone down, her hands trembling. Contest it? With what money? What lawyer would take her case when there was nothing to gain? She looked at the music box again, this small, stubborn object that refused to reveal its secrets. "What were you thinking, Grandma?" she whispered into the empty kitchen. "Why this?" The next few days blurred together in a haze of work and worry. At the hospital, Sarah filed medical records with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. At the diner, she poured coffee and forced smiles, pretending the whispers from the other waitresses didn't reach her ears. But they did. "I heard Sarah Mitchell inherited a music box. Can you believe it? Her rich uncle gets the whole estate, and she gets a music box. Poor thing. She's barely making ends meet as it is. Well, what did she expect? Eleanor wasn't even her real grandmother." The words cut deeper than they should have. Sarah kept her head down, kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant drowning in the weight of it all. At home, Emma noticed the change. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked one evening, her small face creased with worry. Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." But Emma wasn't fooled. She was too smart for that, too attuned to the shifts in Sarah's mood. "Is it because of great-grandma?" Yeah, Sarah admitted softly. I miss her. Emma nodded, her own grief visible in the way she bit her lip. Me too. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah brought the music box to the couch and sat with it in her lap. She ran her fingers over the carvings again, tracing the vines and flowers, searching for something, anything, that might explain why Eleanor had chosen this as her legacy. And then her finger caught on something, a tiny indentation hidden within the design of a rose. She pressed it gently, and with a soft click, a small panel on the side of the box slid open, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Sarah's breath caught as she carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was Eleanor's, unmistakable and elegant, despite the faint tremor that had marked her final years. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the first piece of the puzzle I leave for you. This music box is not what it appears to be. It holds a secret, one that I have carried my entire life, one that I now entrust to you. Long ago, before you were born, before your father was even a thought, I worked for the government during the war. My role was small, or so I believed at the time, but I was part of something much larger. I kept records, I filed documents, and I listened to conversations I was never meant to hear. This music box was given to me by a man I once knew, a man who disappeared shortly after. Inside it, if you can unlock it fully, you will find coordinates. These coordinates lead to a place that the government tried to erase from history, a place where something valuable was hidden. I never had the courage to follow those coordinates myself. I was afraid of what I might find, afraid of who might come looking if I did. But you, Sarah, you are braver than I ever was. You have survived loss and hardship, and you have raised a beautiful daughter, despite everything the world has thrown at you. If you choose to follow this path, know that it will not be easy. There are people who will want to stop you, but there is also something at the end of this journey that could change your life, and Emma's. Trust your instincts, trust yourself, and know that I loved you more than words could ever say. Always, Grandma Eleanor Sarah read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. Not coordinates, a hidden place, something valuable. It sounded impossible, like the plot of a movie, not something that could be real. And yet Eleanor's handwriting was steady, her words clear. This wasn't the rambling of a confused mind. This was intentional, carefully planned. Sarah set the letter down and picked up the music box again, examining it with fresh eyes. If there were coordinates inside, she needed to find a way to fully unlock it. She spent the next hour carefully pressing every inch of the box, searching for hidden mechanisms. Finally, near the base, she found another small indentation, this one shaped like a tiny keyhole, but without an actual lock. She pressed it, and with a soft whir, the entire top of the music box shifted, sliding to one side to reveal a compartment beneath. On inside was a small brass plate engraved with numbers and letters. 38 degrees, 52 minutes north, 77 degrees, 3 minutes west. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and typed the coordinates into a search engine. The result loaded slowly, her cheap internet connection struggling. And then the map appeared. The coordinates pointed to a location just outside of Washington, D.C., in a remote area marked as government property. No buildings were visible on the satellite view, just forest and a few dirt roads. Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing. What was there? What had Eleanor known? And why had she kept this secret for so long? The next morning, Sarah called in sick to both her jobs, a decision that made her stomach churn with anxiety but felt necessary. She couldn't focus on work, not with this mystery demanding her attention. She dropped Emma off at school, then drove to the public library, the only place she knew with free internet and access to archives. She spent hours searching, digging through old newspaper articles and government documents, looking for any mention of the coordinates or the area they pointed to. Most of what she found was vague, references to Cold War-era military installations, classified projects, and redacted reports. But then she found something. A declassified memo from 1962, marked with the heading, Project Nightingale. The memo was heavily redacted, but a few lines stood out. Transfer of assets to secure location. Coordinates to be disclosed only to authorized personnel. Estimated value exceeds $150 million. Sarah's breath caught. $150 million. In 1962. That would be worth far more today. She kept searching, but most of the related documents were still classified or had been destroyed. Whatever Project Nightingale had been, the government had worked hard to bury it. That evening, Sarah sat Emma down at the kitchen table and told her about the music box, about Eleanor's letter, about the coordinates. She didn't mention the money, didn't want to build false hope, but she explained that there was something important Eleanor had wanted her to find. Emma's eyes widened with a mix of fear and excitement. Are we going to go there? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted. It could be dangerous. But what if it's something really important? What if great-grandma left it for us? Sarah looked at her daughter, at the hope flickering in her eyes, and felt something shift inside her. For so long, Sarah had played it safe, had accepted her lot in life. I had survived rather than lived. But maybe, just maybe, this was a chance for something more. We'll see, Sarah said softly. We'll see. Over the next few days, Sarah made plans. She saved every penny she could, cutting back on groceries, skipping meals, anything to scrape together enough money for gas and supplies. She told no one about her plans, afraid that word would spread, afraid that someone would try to stop her. But on the third night, as she was leaving her shift at the diner, she found Victor waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his expensive car with his arms crossed. "Sarah," he said, his voice cold, "we need to talk." Her stomach dropped. About what? About the music box. I've been asking around, and apparently my mother left you something more valuable than she let on. I want to know what's inside it. Sarah's jaw tightened. It's mine, Victor. Eleanor left it to me. She left it to you because she was senile and sentimental. Whatever's in that box belongs to the family, to the estate. The will was clear, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. The music box is mine. Victor stepped closer, his expression hardening. I don't know what kind of scheme you're planning, but if you think you're going to take advantage of my mother's memory, you're wrong. I'll take you to court if I have to. Sarah met his gaze, refusing to back down. Do what you have to do. But you're not getting the music box. Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might push further. But then he stepped back, his lips curling into a thin smile. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Sarah standing in the empty parking lot, her heart racing. That night, she made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. If Victor was already sniffing around, if people were starting to ask questions, then the window of opportunity was closing fast. She would leave in 2 days. She would take Emma out of school for a long weekend, tell the jobs she needed time off for a family emergency, and drive to the coordinates. She would find whatever Eleanor had hidden, and she would do it before Victor or anyone else could stop her. The next morning, Sarah packed a bag, checking and rechecking the supplies: flashlights, batteries, a first aid kit, water bottles, snacks, and the music box, carefully wrapped and secured. She printed out maps of the area. I highlighted routes and noted the nearest towns in case they needed help. Emma watched from the doorway, her expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. Are we really doing this? Sarah looked at her daughter and nodded. Yes, we're really doing this. That evening, Sarah received a text from Linda. Victor is telling people you stole something from the house. He's making a lot of noise. Be careful. Sarah's hands clenched around the phone. She had expected this, but it still stung. Victor wasn't going to let this go quietly. She typed back a quick response. I didn't steal anything. Everything I took was left to me. Linda's reply came fast. I believe you, but he's got people convinced you're up to something. Sarah turned off her phone and set it aside. Let them think what they wanted. She was done caring about Victor's opinions, and done letting other people's judgments dictate her life. The next morning, before dawn, Sarah and Emma loaded the car. The apartment felt hollow as they locked the door behind them, as if they were leaving more than just a temporary home. Sarah didn't let herself think about what would happen if this trip led nowhere, if the coordinates pointed to nothing but empty forest. She couldn't afford to think that way. Not now. They drove in silence as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emma fell asleep against the window, her breath fogging the glass, and Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind a tangle of hope and fear. The coordinates were over 200 miles away, a journey that would take most of the day. Sarah drove carefully, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks, her gaze flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Victor's car following them. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the area marked by the coordinates. The landscape changed here, the suburban sprawl giving way to dense forest and winding roads. Sarah followed the GPS on her phone, the signal growing weaker as they moved deeper into the woods. Finally, the road ended at a rusted gate, chained and locked, a faded sign warning, "No trespassing, government property." Sarah parked the car and stared at the gate, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the place Eleanor had hidden for so long. She turned to Emma, who had woken and was staring at the gate with wide eyes. Stay close to me, okay? No matter what we find, we stay together. Emma nodded, her small hand reaching for Sarah's. They climbed out of the car, the forest around them eerily quiet. Sarah approached the gate, testing the chain. It was old, the metal corroded, and with a hard pull, it snapped free, clattering to the ground with a sound that echoed through the trees. Sarah pushed the gate open, its hinges squealing in protest. Beyond it, a dirt path led deeper into the forest, overgrown with weeds and brambles. She took a deep breath, then stepped through, Emma at her side. The path wound through the trees, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. After about 15 minutes, the path opened into a clearing, and there, half hidden by decades of growth, was a structure. It was low and squat, built into the hillside, concrete walls stained with moss and age. A steel door, rusted but intact, stood at the entrance, a faded government seal barely visible on its surface. Sarah's breath caught. This was it. This was the place Eleanor had led her to. She approached the door slowly, her heart hammering. There was no lock, no keyhole, just a heavy handle. She gripped it with both hands and pulled. The door resisted at first, years of neglect holding it shut. But then, with a groan of metal, it gave way, swinging open to reveal darkness beyond. Sarah pulled out her flashlight and shone it inside. A narrow corridor stretched ahead, disappearing into shadow. She looked at Emma, whose eyes were wide with fear and wonder. Ready? Emma nodded, her hand squeezing Sarah's tighter. Together, they stepped inside. The air was cooler here, stale and heavy. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls lined with peeling paint and floors covered in dust. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing. The corridor led to a larger room, and Sarah's breath caught as the flashlight revealed what lay inside. Rows upon rows of metal shelves, each one stacked with wooden crates. Some had spilled open, their contents visible in the dim light. Gold bars, stacks of old currency, jewelry glinting faintly in the flashlight's beam, and in the center of the room, a large steel trunk, its lid closed but unlocked. Sarah stepped forward, her legs trembling. She knelt beside the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, files marked top secret, and bundles of bearer bonds, each one worth thousands, maybe millions. She stared, unable to process what she was seeing. This was real, all of it. The music box, Eleanor's letter, the coordinates. It had all led to this. "Mom." Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "What is all this?" Sarah looked at her daughter, then back at the treasure surrounding them. "It's a second chance," she whispered. "It's a way out." For the first time in years, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to hope. Sarah knelt in the darkness of the underground facility, her flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the impossible wealth surrounding her. Gold bars stacked like bricks. Bundles of currency so old the paper had yellowed, but the ink remained sharp. Bearer bonds with denominations that made her head spin. And jewelry, pieces that looked like they belonged in museums, not forgotten in a Cold War bunker. Emma moved closer, her small hand gripping Sarah's arm. "Mom, is this real?" "I think so," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. She reached into the trunk again, pulling out one of the bearer bonds. The paper felt thick, official, the watermark visible when she held it up to the light. $1 million. And there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. She set the bond down carefully and stood, her legs unsteady. The room seemed to spin around her, the weight of discovery pressing down like a physical force. This wasn't just money. This was a fortune. The kind of wealth that could erase every debt, every worry, every sleepless night spent calculating which bills to pay and which to let slide. But it was also dangerous. She knew that instinctively, the way prey knows when a predator is near. Whatever Project Nightingale had been, on whatever reason the government had for hiding this wealth in a forgotten bunker, it wasn't something they would want exposed. And Victor, if he found out, would do everything in his power to take it from her. "We need to document this," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. The signal was dead this deep in the forest, but the camera still worked. She began taking photos, methodically capturing every angle of the room, every crate, every visible item. Emma helped, using Sarah's old backup phone to record video, her narration soft and odd. "There are so many gold bars," Emma whispered into the camera. "And Mom says those papers are worth millions." Sarah worked quickly, her hands steadier now that she had a task. She photographed the documents in the trunk, careful not to disturb them too much. Most were marked with classification stamps, or top secret and eyes only, dated between 1960 and 1963. Some referenced Project Nightingale directly. Others mentioned asset transfers and emergency protocols. One document caught her attention, a memo on official letterhead from the Department of Defense. She read it twice, her throat tightening with each pass. In the event of catastrophic national emergency, assets contained within Facility 7 are to be redistributed according to protocols outlined in Document 447-B. All personnel involved in original transfer are deceased as of 1985. Facility location to remain classified indefinitely. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the memo. Everyone involved was dead. The facility was supposed to stay classified forever. And yet Eleanor had known about it, had kept the secret for decades, had given Sarah the key to finding it. Why? The question hung in the stale air as Sarah continued documenting. After 30 minutes, she had hundreds of photos and several videos, proof that this place existed, that the fortune was real. But proof also meant exposure, and exposure meant danger. "Mom, what are we going to do?" Emma asked, her voice small in the darkness. Sarah looked at her daughter, at the fear and excitement warring in her young eyes, and felt something harden inside her. They had come this far. They had found what Eleanor meant them to find. Walking away now would be surrendering to the same forces that had kept her poor, powerless, and struggling for years. "We're going to be smart about this," Sarah said firmly. "We're going to get help. Someone who knows how to handle this kind of situation." They left the facility carefully, Sarah pulling the steel door closed behind them, but not locking it. If they needed to return, she wanted access. They walked back through the forest to the car, the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees in golden shafts that felt almost mocking in their beauty. The world above ground seemed impossibly normal, as if nothing earth-shattering had just happened below. Sarah drove back toward civilization in silence, her mind racing through possibilities. She needed a lawyer, someone with experience in government affairs and asset recovery. She needed security, someone to watch the site until she could figure out what to do with it. And most importantly, she needed to keep this secret from Victor until she had protections in place. By the time they reached a town with cell service, it was nearly evening. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a small diner and checked her phone. 17 missed calls, 12 voicemails, 23 text messages. Most were from Victor. "Where are you? You're making a huge mistake. I know you're up to something. Call me immediately." And then, the most recent one, sent just 15 minutes ago. "I've reported the music box as stolen property. The police are looking for you." Sarah's blood ran cold. She scrolled through the other messages. 2 were from her supervisor at the hospital, asking where she was and reminding her that unexcused absences could lead to termination. 3 were from the diner manager, increasingly angry about her not showing up for her shifts. And 1 was from Linda. "Victor is telling everyone you ran off with stolen property. He's filed a police report. I don't know what's going on, but be careful." Sarah sat in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Victor was escalating. He was trying to force her into a corner, to make her desperate enough to hand over whatever she'd found. "Mom?" Emma's voice was quiet, worried. "Are we in trouble?" Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. "Not if we do this right. But we need help." She thought of Gerald Hayes, a lawyer Eleanor had mentioned once or twice, someone she'd known during her government days. Sarah had never met him, but Eleanor had spoken highly of his integrity and discretion. If anyone could help navigate this situation, it would be him. She searched for his contact information on her phone, found a law office in Arlington, Virginia, and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before someone answered. Hayes and Associates. How may I direct your call?" "I need to speak with Gerald Hayes," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's urgent. It's about Eleanor Mitchell." There was a pause. "I'm sorry. Mr. Hayes is in meetings all day. If you'd like to leave a message, tell him Eleanor Mitchell's granddaughter needs his help. Tell him it's about Project Nightingale." Another pause, longer this time. "Please hold." The line went silent. Then classical music filled Sarah's ear. She waited, counting her heartbeats, watching Emma through the rearview mirror. The little girl was playing on the old backup phone, re-watching the videos they'd taken, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. After 3 minutes, the music cut off and a man's voice came on the line, deep and measured. "This is Gerald Hayes. Who am I speaking with?" "My name is Sarah Mitchell. Eleanor Mitchell was my grandmother. She passed away last week." I heard, Gerald said, his tone softening slightly. I'm very sorry for your loss. Eleanor was a remarkable woman. She left me something, Sarah said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. A music box with coordinates. I followed them, and I found something big. I need help. Gerald was silent for a long moment. Then, where are you right now? About 30 miles outside of D.C. Can you come to my office tonight? Sarah glanced at Emma, at the exhaustion visible in her daughter's posture. Yes. We'll be there in an hour. Good. Don't talk to anyone else about this. And Sarah, be careful. If you found what I think you found, there are people who will do anything to keep it buried. The line went dead. Sarah drove to Arlington with a knot of tension coiled in her stomach. The city lights felt harsh after the darkness of the forest, the traffic oppressive. She parked in front of a modest office building just as the sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray. Gerald Hayes's office was on the 3rd floor, a suite with his name etched in gold on the door. Sarah knocked, and a moment later, the door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, gray-haired and distinguished, with sharp eyes that assessed her in a single glance. Sarah Mitchell, he said, not a question but a confirmation. Come in. His office was lined with bookshelves, legal texts, and historical volumes crammed together in organized chaos. And a large desk dominated the center of the room, papers neatly stacked, a laptop open to a document Sarah couldn't read from the doorway. Gerald gestured to 2 chairs across from his desk. Sit. Tell me everything. Sarah did. She started with Eleanor's funeral, with Victor's dismissal, with the music box and the letter hidden inside. She told him about the coordinates, the journey to the facility, the discovery of the fortune. She showed him the photos on her phone, watched as his expression shifted from skepticism to something much more serious. When she finished, Gerald leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Do you understand what you've stumbled into? Not really, Sarah admitted. Project Nightingale was a Cold War operation designed to create emergency funds in case of Soviet invasion or nuclear war. The government transferred massive amounts of gold, currency, and bearer bonds to hidden facilities across the country. Most were eventually recovered or reallocated, but a few were lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, especially after the people who knew about them died or retired. This facility, Facility 7, was supposed to have been emptied in 1985, but clearly that never happened. So it belongs to the government, Sarah said, her heart sinking. Technically, yes, but that's where things get complicated. Bearer bonds, for example, are payable to whoever holds them. There's no registry, no ownership record. If you have possession, you have ownership. The gold and currency are trickier, but with the right legal arguments, you could make a strong case that this constitutes abandoned property. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. So I could keep it? Possibly. But the government will fight you. They'll claim national security, state secrets, all the usual justifications. And you'll need to move fast, because once word gets out, you'll have more than just federal agents to worry about. There are private interests, criminal organizations, people who make a living finding and exploiting situations exactly like this. Sarah swallowed hard. What do I do? Gerald stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. First, we establish legal representation. I'll take your case pro bono, in Eleanor's memory. Second, we document everything and secure the site. I have contacts, people who can help with security. Third, we go public before anyone can bury this. We file claims. We alert the media. And we make it impossible for the government to disappear you or the fortune. Go public? Sarah's voice cracked. That's terrifying. It's also your best protection. Secrets can be buried. Public knowledge can't. Sarah looked at Emma, who had been listening quietly, her eyes wide. What if Victor tries to take it? He's already filed a police report, saying I stole the music box. Gerald's expression hardened. Victor Mitchell has no legal standing. The music box was left to you in a legally binding will. The police report is harassment, nothing more. But it does mean we need to move quickly. If he learns what you've found, he'll escalate. He already is escalating, Sarah said quietly. Gerald turned to face her fully. Then we escalate too. Give me 24 hours. I'll have everything in place. Security at the site. Legal documents filed. Media contacts ready. In the meantime, you and Emma need to stay somewhere safe. Not your apartment. Not anywhere Victor knows about. I don't have money for a hotel, Sarah admitted, shame burning in her cheeks. Gerald waved a hand dismissively. I have a guest house behind my property in Bethesda. It's yours for as long as you need it. No one will find you there. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Kindness, real kindness, felt foreign after so many years of struggle. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Gerald said. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. He wasn't wrong. The guest house was small but comfortable, a converted carriage house with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar. Sarah and Emma settled in, exhaustion hitting them both like a wave. And Emma fell asleep almost immediately, curled under a thick quilt, her face peaceful in a way Sarah hadn't seen in months. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, unable to rest. Her phone buzzed constantly. More messages from Victor, more threats disguised as concern. She turned it off. The silence that followed both a relief and a new kind of anxiety. Gerald knocked on the door an hour later, carrying a file folder and a laptop. Can we talk? Sarah let him in, and they sat across from each other at the table. Gerald opened the folder, revealing documents, maps, and notes written in his precise handwriting. I've been making calls, he said. Quietly. The government doesn't officially know about the facility yet, but they will soon. I've also started drafting the legal claim. We're arguing abandoned property, custodial rights based on Eleanor's connection to the original project, and rightful inheritance through her bequest to you. Will it work? Honestly, it's a long shot. But it's the best shot we have. The key is moving fast and creating public pressure. Once the story breaks, the government will have to respond carefully. They can't simply seize the assets without due process, not if the media and public are watching. Sarah rubbed her face, feeling the weight of sleepless nights pressing down. This is insane. A week ago I was just trying to make rent. Now I'm fighting the federal government over millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions, Gerald corrected gently. Based on your photos, I'd estimate the total value at somewhere between $180 and $200 million. Possibly more, depending on the jewelry and other assets you haven't fully documented yet. The number was so large it felt meaningless. Sarah couldn't conceptualize that kind of wealth, couldn't imagine what it would mean to actually possess it. What happens if we lose? She asked. The government seizes everything. You walk away with nothing, and you'll likely face legal challenges from Victor as well, claiming you wasted estate resources or acted inappropriately. At worst, they might try to charge you with trespassing on government property or mishandling classified materials. So I could lose everything and end up in jail. Gerald's expression was serious. Yes, that's the risk. But Sarah, if you do nothing, if you walk away now, you guarantee that outcome. Victor will hound you. The government will eventually discover the site through their own channels, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. At least this way, you're fighting. You're claiming what Eleanor wanted you to have. Sarah thought of her grandmother, of the letter, of the music box that had started all of this. Eleanor had taken a risk in trusting her with this secret. She'd believed Sarah was strong enough to see it through. "Okay," Sarah said quietly. "Let's do it." Gerald nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, everything changes." But sleep didn't come easily. Sarah lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning through possibilities and fears. Emma slept soundly in the next room, her soft breathing a reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about money, it was about security, about giving her daughter a future that didn't involve hand-me-down clothes and nights spent hungry because the paycheck didn't stretch far enough. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by her phone buzzing. She'd turned it back on to set an alarm, and now messages flooded in, dozens of them, all from numbers she didn't recognize. She scrolled through them, her stomach sinking with each one. "You're a thief. Give back what you stole. Victor Mitchell is a good man. You're trying to ruin him. Hope you rot for what you did." Someone had posted her phone number online. Victor, almost certainly. A smear campaign designed to isolate her, to make her seem like the villain in a story he was carefully crafting. Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the phone against the wall. Instead, she took a screenshot of the messages and forwarded them to Gerald. Evidence. Everything was evidence now. Morning came too quickly. Gerald arrived at 7 with coffee, bagels, and a team. 2 security consultants, both ex-military, who would be heading to the facility to secure it. A paralegal named Monica, sharp-eyed and efficient, who would be handling media outreach. And a woman named Dr. Yolanda Chen, an expert in historical asset authentication. "Dr. Chen will accompany you back to the site," Gerald explained as they gathered in the guest house living room. "We need professional documentation of everything you found. Photos aren't enough. We need expert testimony." Dr. Chen nodded, her expression serious. "I specialize in Cold War-era materials. If what you found is genuine, I'll be able to confirm it, and my credentials will hold up in court." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden activity, by the number of people now involved in something that had started as a private quest. But she also felt a strange sense of relief. She wasn't alone anymore. They caravanned back to the facility, 3 vehicles moving through the early morning traffic. Sarah drove with Emma and Dr. Chen. The 2 security consultants followed in a black SUV, and Gerald brought up the rear in his sedan. The forest felt different in daylight, less ominous, but no less significant. When they reached the rusted gate, the security team went in first, sweeping the area for any sign that someone else had been there. After 10 minutes, they gave the all clear, and Sarah led the group down the overgrown path to the facility. Dr. Von Chen's reaction upon entering was everything Sarah had hoped for. The older woman froze just inside the doorway, her flashlight beam sweeping across the shelves and crates, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to genuine awe. "My God," she breathed. "It's real, all of it." She moved through the room methodically, photographing, measuring, carefully examining individual items. She opened crates, inspected gold bars, held bearer bonds up to the light, and made detailed notes on a tablet. The security team set up portable lights, filling the space with harsh white illumination that revealed the full scope of the discovery. Hours passed. Emma grew bored and restless, and Sarah took her outside to sit on a fallen log, sharing granola bars and water while the adults worked. The forest around them was peaceful, a bird singing in the trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves. "Mom," Emma said quietly, "if we get to keep all that money, what will we do?" Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "What do you want to do?" Emma thought for a moment. "I want a house, a real house with my own room, and I want you to not be tired all the time." Sarah's throat tightened. "That sounds perfect. And maybe a dog," Emma added, a small smile playing at her lips. "Maybe a dog," Sarah agreed. By early afternoon, Dr. Chen emerged from the facility, her expression grave but certain. It's authentic, all of it. The gold is U.S. government issue. The bearer bonds are genuine. The currency is from the right time period. The jewelry appears to be of museum quality, possibly seized assets or diplomatic gifts. The total value, although based on preliminary assessment, is approximately $194 million. Sarah felt the number like a physical blow. $194 million. It was real. It was documented. And now, it was a fight. Gerald made calls while the security team set up perimeter sensors and cameras around the facility. Within an hour, he had responses. The Washington Post wanted an exclusive. So did CNN. Multiple law firms offered their services, smelling blood in the water. But Gerald politely declined on Sarah's behalf. "We're going with the Post first," Gerald said. "They have the credibility and reach we need. The reporter, Amanda Torres, is solid. She won't sensationalize, but she won't pull punches either." Sarah nodded numbly, feeling like she was watching events unfold from outside her own body. They drove back to Bethesda, and by evening, Amanda Torres arrived at Gerald's guest house. She was younger than Sarah expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Thank you for meeting with me," Amanda said as she set up a recorder on the kitchen table. "I have to admit, when Gerald called and said you'd found a Cold War bunker full of hundreds of millions in lost government assets, I thought he was joking." "I wish he was," Sarah said quietly. The interview took 3 hours. Amanda asked everything, from Eleanor's background to the discovery of the music box, from the coordinates to the moment Sarah first saw the fortune. She asked about Victor, about the threats, about Sarah's financial situation. Some questions felt invasive, too personal, but Gerald encouraged her to answer honestly. "The public needs to see you as a real person," he explained. "Not a fortune hunter, but a struggling single mother who inherited a mystery and followed it to its conclusion. Sympathy is a powerful weapon." When Amanda finally packed up her equipment, she looked at Sarah with something like respect. "This is going to explode tomorrow. Be ready." "How do I get ready for something like this?" Amanda's smile was sympathetic. "You don't? You just survive it." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep again. She paced the guest house, checking her phone obsessively despite knowing the story wouldn't break until morning. Emma slept soundly, oblivious to the storm about to hit. At dawn, Gerald knocked on the door. "It's live." They gathered around his laptop in the guest house living room. The Washington Post homepage loaded, and there, at the very top, she was the headline, "Single Mother Discovers $194 million Cold War Fortune." After inheriting grandmother's music box, below it, Amanda's article began. When Sarah Mitchell inherited a music box from her late grandmother, she never expected it would lead her to one of the most significant discoveries in Cold War history. But the coordinates hidden inside that box pointed to a forgotten government facility containing nearly $200 million in lost assets, and now she's fighting to keep what she found. Sarah read the article twice, seeing her own story reflected back through Amanda's careful prose. The journalist had captured everything: the struggle, the poverty, the mockery from Victor, the discovery, the fight ahead. She'd included quotes from Dr. Chen confirming the authenticity, from Gerald explaining the legal situation, and even managed to get a no comment from a Department of Defense spokesperson. "It's everywhere," Monica said, scrolling through her own laptop. CNN picked it up. So did NBC, Fox, BBC, every major outlet. Social media is exploding. The hashtag is already trending. Sarah pulled up Twitter on her phone and searched. Hashtag musicbox. Fortune was indeed trending, with thousands of posts appearing every minute. Some were supportive, calling Sarah brave and celebrating her discovery. Others were skeptical, claiming it was a hoax or that she had no right to the money. And then there were the ones from Victor's supporters, or possibly Victor himself using fake accounts. Sarah Mitchell is a thief. She stole from her grandmother's estate and is lying about this discovery. Don't believe her crocodile tears. Victor Mitchell is the real victim here. His sister-in-law is trying to steal his inheritance. Disgusting. Sarah felt sick reading them, but Gerald pulled the laptop away. Don't engage. Don't even read them. The truth is out there now. That's what matters. By midday, the situation had escalated beyond anything Sarah had imagined. News vans parked outside Gerald's property, reporters shouting questions over the fence. Her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, book deals, movie rights. Gerald fielded them all, accepting a few carefully chosen interviews and declining the rest. Sarah did a live interview with CNN at 2 in the afternoon, sitting in Gerald's office with Monica coaching her through it. The anchor, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a sympathetic expression, asked the expected questions, and Sarah answered as honestly as she could. Some people are saying you should turn everything over to the government, the anchor said. What do you say to that? Sarah took a deep breath. I say that my grandmother worked for the government during the Cold War. She knew about this facility, and she chose to leave me the means to find it. This wasn't a theft. This was an inheritance, just like any other. And I'm going to fight to keep what she wanted me to have. The interview went viral within an hour, but the backlash came faster than the support. By evening, the Department of Justice had released a statement claiming that all assets found in the facility were government property and demanding their immediate return. They threatened legal action if Sarah didn't comply within 72 hours. Victor held a press conference outside Eleanor's old house, and surrounded by supportive relatives and looking appropriately grief-stricken. My mother would be horrified by what Sarah is doing, he said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. She was a patriot. She would never want these assets kept from the government. Sarah is dishonoring her memory, and I intend to fight this in court. Sarah watched the press conference from the guest house, her hands clenched into fists. Gerald stood beside her, his expression dark. He's going to file a lawsuit, Gerald said, claiming the music box should have been part of the estate proper, that Eleanor wasn't of sound mind when she made the will, all the usual tactics. Can he win? Not on the merits. But he can drag this out, make it expensive, make it painful. That's his goal. He wants to exhaust you financially and emotionally until you give up. Sarah's jaw tightened. I won't give up. Good. Because tomorrow, we file our claim in federal court. And then the real fight begins. That night, Sarah stood outside the guest house, looking up at the stars. Emma was inside, finally asleep after a day of chaos and confusion. The world felt impossibly large suddenly, and Sarah felt impossibly small within it. But she wasn't alone. Gerald was fighting for her. Dr. Chen had staked her reputation on the discovery's authenticity. Monica was managing the media circus with skill and grace. And somewhere out there, Eleanor was watching, having set all of this in motion. Sarah touched the music box in her pocket, the small wooden object that had changed everything. Thank you, Grandma, she whispered into the night, for trusting me, for believing I could do this. The stars offered no answer, but the silence felt less lonely now. Tomorrow would bring new battles. The government would come with their lawyers and their authority. Victor would come with his wealth and his cruelty. But Sarah Mitchell, the struggling single mother who had been dismissed and mocked and pushed to the edge, was ready to fight. Because some things were worth fighting for. And this, she had finally realized, was one of them. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., stood like a monument to power and authority, its marble columns rising toward a gray morning sky. Sarah climbed the steps with Emma beside her, Gerald and Monica flanking them protectively. Behind them, a wall of reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing in rapid succession that turned the world into stuttering snapshots of chaos. Sarah, how do you respond to claims you're stealing from American taxpayers? Do you think you deserve this money more than the government? What about your uncle's allegations that Eleanor wasn't mentally competent? Sarah kept her eyes forward, her hand tight on Emma's shoulder. Gerald had coached her. Don't engage on the courthouse steps. Don't give them ammunition. Stay focused. Stay dignified. Stay strong. Inside, the courthouse was cooler, quieter, the thick walls muting the outside noise to a distant murmur. They passed through security and made their way to courtroom 6, where Judge Margaret Holloway would hear the preliminary arguments on the government's motion to seize all assets found in the facility. Judge Holloway had a reputation for being fair but exacting, intolerant of theatrics but respectful of well-reasoned legal arguments. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair cut short and sharp eyes that seemed to see through every pretense. Sarah both hoped for and feared her judgment. The courtroom filled quickly. On one side sat the government's legal team, 5 attorneys in expensive suits, backed by representatives from the Department of Justice, the Treasury, and Defense. On the other side, Sarah sat with Gerald and Monica, a David facing multiple Goliaths. Victor arrived just before the hearing began, taking a seat in the gallery behind the government's table. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her a smile that held no warmth, only cold satisfaction. He thought he'd already won. The bailiff called the room to order. At once, Judge Holloway entered, her black robes flowing as she took her seat at the bench. She surveyed the packed courtroom with an expression that suggested she was already tired of whatever circus was about to unfold. "Let's begin," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "This is a preliminary hearing on the government's motion for immediate seizure of assets. Counsel for the United States, you may proceed." The lead government attorney, a man named Robert Castellane, who looked like he'd been born in a suit, rose smoothly. "Thank you, Your Honor. The United States moves for immediate seizure of all assets found in the facility designated as Site 7 under the Cold War emergency provisions. These assets were placed there by the government during a time of national crisis and remain government property under federal law. Ms. Mitchell's unauthorized removal and claim to these assets constitutes theft of federal property." He spoke for 15 minutes, citing statutes and precedents, painting Sarah as someone who had trespassed on government land and taken what didn't belong to her. His words were polished, his delivery confident. He made it sound so simple, so obvious that the government was in the right. When he finished, Judge Holloway turned to Gerald. "Mr. Hayes, your response?" Gerald stood, and Sarah noticed he didn't have the same polished ease as Castellane. He looked more like a professor than a litigator, rumpled and intense, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. "Your Honor, the government's argument rests on a fundamental misrepresentation. They claim Site 7 was an active government facility, but their own documents, which we've submitted as Exhibit A, show that the facility was decommissioned in 1963, and all personnel associated with it were declared deceased by 1985. The facility was not merely forgotten, it was deliberately erased from official records." Gerald pulled up a document on the courtroom's display screen. This memo, dated 1985, from the Department of Defense, states explicitly that facility location to remain classified indefinitely, and that all personnel involved in original transfer are deceased. The government abandoned this site, Your Honor. They didn't just forget about it. They chose to bury it, to pretend it never existed. And under federal treasure trove law, abandoned property discovered on accessible land belongs to the finder. Castellane stood immediately. Your Honor, the classification of the site doesn't constitute abandonment. I'll hear your rebuttal in due time, Mr. Castellane, Judge Holloway said sharply. Mr. Hayes, continue. Gerald nodded. Furthermore, Miss Mitchell didn't trespass. She followed coordinates left to her by her grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, who worked for the government during the period when Site 7 was active. Eleanor had legal knowledge of the site's existence and chose to pass that knowledge to her granddaughter. This was an inheritance, Your Honor, no different than if Eleanor had left Sarah the deed to a house. Except this wasn't a house, Castellane interjected, unable to help himself. This was classified government property containing strategic assets. Judge Holloway's gaze could have cut glass. Mr. Castellane, I don't recall recognizing you to speak. One more interruption, and I'll hold you in contempt. Castellane sat, his jaw tight. Gerald continued, building momentum. The government claims these assets are vital to national security, but they didn't know they existed until Ms. Mitchell found them. For 60 years, nearly $200 million sat in a forgotten bunker, doing nothing, serving no one. The government didn't protect it. They didn't even remember it. They have no grounds now to claim ownership simply because someone else did the work of rediscovery. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, what about the classified documents found at the site? Those clearly remain government property regardless of abandonment arguments. We don't dispute that, Your Honor. Ms. Mitchell is willing to return all classified documents to the appropriate agencies. But the financial assets, the gold, the bonds, the jewelry, those are different. Those are property, not secrets. And under the law, abandoned property belongs to the finder. The judge turned to Castellane. Your rebuttal? Castellane stood again, his composure recovered. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes wants this court to believe that the United States government simply forgot about nearly $200 million in assets. That's absurd. The facility was classified for reasons of national security. Just because records aren't public doesn't mean the property was abandoned. The government has an ongoing interest in all Cold War-era installations and materials. Can you provide evidence of that ongoing interest? Judge Holloway asked. Any documentation showing the government checked on Site 7 in the last, say, 30 years? Castellane hesitated. So the classification itself demonstrates ongoing interest. That's not what I asked. Do you have evidence that anyone from the government visited, inspected, or even thought about Site 7 since 1985? The classified nature of the program makes it difficult to provide such documentation in open court. Mr. Castellane, the judge's voice was dry. If you're going to argue that something is too secret to prove in court, you're going to have a very difficult time convincing me the government has been properly maintaining its interest in this property. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Judge Holloway wasn't simply accepting the government's arguments at face value. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, arguments flying back and forth. Castellane brought up national security repeatedly, as if the words themselves were magical incantations that would win the day. Gerald countered with property law, with precedent, with the simple fact that the government had no credible claim to property they deliberately erased from existence. Finally, Judge Holloway called for a recess. I'll hear final arguments after lunch. 2 hours. They filed out of the courtroom, and immediately the reporters descended. Gerald held up a hand, creating a small barrier as they pushed toward the exit. No comment at this time. Let the process work. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Victor was already talking to reporters, his face a mask of righteous indignation. This is a travesty of justice. My mother would be rolling in her grave seeing her granddaughter trying to steal from the American people. Sarah felt Monica's hand on her arm, pulling her away before she could respond. Don't give him what he wants. They had lunch in Gerald's office, takeout sandwiches that Sarah couldn't taste. Emma sat quietly, drawing pictures, her way of coping with stress. The little girl had been remarkably strong through all of this, but Sarah could see the toll it was taking, the shadows under her eyes, the way she startled at sudden noises. How do you think it's going? Sarah asked Gerald quietly. He unwrapped his sandwich slowly, considering. Holloway is skeptical of the government's position, which is good. But this is just the preliminary hearing. Even if she rules in our favor today, this case will drag on for months, maybe years. The government has unlimited resources to appeal, to file motions, to make this as difficult as possible. Can we win? Gerald met her eyes. Eventually? Yes, I think so. The law's on our side. But winning might take everything you have. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought about the apartment she couldn't return to, the jobs she'd lost, the life that had been turned inside out in less than 2 weeks. She thought about Emma, about the future this fortune could provide, about Eleanor's faith in her. Yes, she said simply. I'm prepared. They returned to the courtroom for final arguments. Castellane went first, his tone more aggressive now, perhaps sensing he was losing ground. He painted Sarah as an opportunist, someone who had exploited a loophole to steal from the nation. He made her sound greedy, manipulative, undeserving. Sarah sat through it with her jaw clenched, forcing herself to remain calm even as Victor nodded along approvingly from the gallery. Then Gerald stood for his final argument, and his tone was different now. Not aggressive, but passionate, the kind of passion that came from genuine belief. Your Honor, the government wants you to see this as a simple case of theft. But it's not. This is a case about a woman who lost everything. Sarah Mitchell is a single mother working 2 jobs, barely keeping a roof over her daughter's head. Her grandmother, knowing she was dying, left her the one thing that could change her life, the truth about a secret the government tried to bury. Gerald gestured toward Sarah. Eleanor Mitchell worked for the government during the Cold War. She kept their secrets. She was loyal. But when she was dying, she thought about her granddaughter struggling in poverty, and she made a choice. She gave Sarah the means to find what had been lost, and not to hurt anyone, but to help the person she loved most. He turned back to the judge. The government had 60 years to claim this property, 60 years to maintain it, to remember it, to do something with it. They didn't. They buried it and forgot about it. Sarah Mitchell did what they failed to do. She found it. She documented it. She brought it back into the light. Under the law, that makes it hers. And if we reward her for this, Castellane said, unable to resist, we incentivize trespassing on every classified site in the country. The site wasn't marked, Gerald shot back. There were no fences, no signs, no indication it was restricted. Ms. Mitchell followed coordinates to public land and found a forgotten facility. That's not trespassing. That's discovery. Judge Holloway held up her hand, silencing both attorneys. Enough. I've heard what I need to hear. I'll issue my ruling by the end of the week. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Outside, the media frenzy had grown. News helicopters circled overhead. Protesters had gathered, some supporting Sarah, others waving signs calling her a thief. The division was stark, angry, loud. Gerald hustled Sarah and Emma into a waiting car, and they drove back to the guest house in tense silence. Monica was already working her phone, managing the narrative, pushing back against Victor's statements. He's doing interviews with anyone who will listen, Monica said. Fox, MSNBC, even some podcast hosts. He's claiming Eleanor was senile, that you manipulated her, and that the music box was always meant to be his. Can we sue him for defamation? Sarah asked. Possibly. But that's another fight, another courtroom. Let's win this one first. The next 3 days were torture. Sarah couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop checking her phone for news. The public opinion was split almost exactly down the middle. Half saw her as a hero, someone who had fought the system and won. The other half saw her as a thief hiding behind legal technicalities. Victor kept doing interviews, his face plastered across every news channel. He'd hired his own attorney, a shark named Patricia Volkov, who specialized in estate disputes. They were preparing to file a separate lawsuit challenging Eleanor's will, claiming undue influence and lack of mental capacity. They're trying to drown you in legal fees, Gerald explained, and force you to fight on multiple fronts until you can't afford to continue. How much is this costing? Sarah asked quietly. Gerald hesitated. More than you want to know. But we'll figure it out. Some of the costs I'm absorbing. Monica's working at a reduced rate. We believe in this case. What if we lose? We won't. But Gerald's confidence felt fragile, like something that could shatter with one wrong word from Judge Holloway. On Friday afternoon, 3 days after the hearing, Gerald's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then closed his eyes. Thank you. We'll be there. He looked at Sarah. Holloway's ready to rule. We need to be in court in 1 hour. The drive back to the courthouse felt like traveling through molasses, time stretching and warping. Sarah's hands shook as she helped Emma into the car. Monica drove. Gerald making calls, his voice low and urgent. The courtroom was packed again, every seat filled, people standing against the back wall. Victor sat in his usual spot, Volkov beside him, both looking confident. The government's team sat stone-faced, giving nothing away. Judge Holloway entered, and the room fell silent. She looked tired, Sarah thought, as if this case had weighed on her more than she'd expected. I've reviewed the arguments and the evidence, the judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. This is an unusual case, one that raises difficult questions about property rights, government authority, and the nature of abandonment. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. The government argues that classification equals ongoing ownership. That simply because they declared a site secret. They maintain rights to it indefinitely. I disagree. Classification is not a magic shield that protects the government from the consequences of its own negligence. Castellane's face tightened. The evidence shows that Site 7 was not just forgotten. It was deliberately erased. Personnel records were destroyed. Location data was removed from active databases. The government didn't just fail to maintain the property. They worked actively to pretend it didn't exist. Judge Holloway's gaze swept across the courtroom. Under federal treasure trove doctrine, abandoned property found on accessible land belongs to the finder. The government has failed to demonstrate that Site 7 was not abandoned. They've failed to show any evidence of ongoing interest or maintenance. They've failed to prove that Ms. Mitchell had any reason to know the site was restricted. Sarah felt Gerald's hand grip her arm. Therefore, I'm denying the government's motion for immediate seizure. The assets found at Site 7, with the exception of classified documents, which will be returned to the appropriate agencies, are hereby declared the property of Sarah Mitchell, subject to final resolution of ownership in the full trial. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed for the doors. Victor surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. The government attorneys huddled together, already planning their appeal. But Sarah heard none of it. She sat frozen, Gerald's words from earlier echoing in her mind. Subject to final resolution of ownership in the full trial. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. But they'd won the first battle. Judge Holloway banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. This is a preliminary ruling. Both parties have the right to appeal and to present further evidence at trial. But for now, Ms. Mitchell retains possession of the non-classified assets, pending final resolution. Court is adjourned. Gerald pulled Sarah to her feet. We need to move. Now. They fought through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions, the microphones thrust in their faces. Outside, Monica had the car waiting, engine running. To the bank, Gerald said. We need to secure the bearer bonds immediately before the government tries to freeze them. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Gerald had arranged for a secure facility to store the physical assets, a high-security vault where the gold and jewelry would be kept under guard. The bearer bonds were more complicated, requiring authentication and redemption through various financial institutions, but Gerald had contacts who could expedite the process. By evening, everything was secured. The fortune was real, documented, protected. And legally, at least for now, it was Sarah's. They returned to the guest house to find it surrounded by reporters again. Gerald drove past, not stopping, and took them instead to a hotel in Virginia, a quiet place where he'd registered rooms under a false name. You need to disappear for a few days, he said, as they sat in the hotel room. Let the media frenzy die down. Let the government lick their wounds and decide whether they want to appeal. Give Victor time to realize he's lost. Has he lost? Sarah asked. He's still filing that lawsuit about the will? He'll lose that too. Eleanor's will was properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. She was of sound mind, confirmed by her doctor's records. Volkov is grasping at straws. But yes, he'll drag it out as long as he can. Sarah looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep on one of the hotel beds, exhausted by the day's stress. I just want this to be over. I want to go home. I know, Gerald said gently, and you will. But right now, you need to let the process work. The government will probably appeal Holloway's ruling. That'll take months. Victor's lawsuit will take months. In the meantime, we start the redemption process on the bonds. We arrange sales of the gold through proper channels. We do everything by the book, so clean and transparent that no one can claim you're hiding anything. And then you wait. You be patient. You stay strong, because eventually you're going to win. Monica nodded. The public opinion is shifting. Holloway's ruling gave you legitimacy. More people are seeing you as the victim of government overreach rather than a thief. We're going to use that. Over the next 2 months, Sarah learned to live in a strange kind of limbo. She couldn't return to her apartment, which had been vandalized twice, once by angry strangers who thought she was stealing from taxpayers, once by someone she suspected was hired by Victor. She couldn't return to her jobs, which had both fired her for excessive absences. But she also couldn't access most of the fortune yet. The bearer bonds were in redemption process, which Gerald said could take 6 months to a year. The gold was secured, but couldn't be sold until the legal situation resolved completely. The jewelry was in appraisal, its value being determined by experts. Gerald covered their expenses, advancing money against the eventual settlement. Sarah kept careful track of every dollar, determined to pay him back with interest. Emma was enrolled in a private school near the hotel, a temporary arrangement that felt more permanent with each passing day. The government did appeal Holloway's ruling, as expected. The case moved to the circuit court, where it would sit for months waiting for a hearing date. Victor's lawsuit crawled through probate court, Volkov filing motion after motion, each one more desperate than the last. And through it all, the media attention slowly shifted. The initial frenzy faded into occasional updates, then rare mentions. Sarah's story became part of the cultural conversation, debated on talk shows and social media, but without the same fever-pitch intensity. In March, 3 months after the discovery, the first bearer bond was successfully redeemed. $2 million, transferred into an account Gerald had set up under Sarah's name. It was real money, liquid assets she could actually use. Sarah stared at the bank statement, unable to process the number. $2 million. More money than she'd earned in a lifetime of working 2 jobs. And it was just the first bond. There were dozens more in process. "What do I do with it?" she asked Gerald. "Whatever you want," he said with a smile. "It's yours." Sarah thought about that for a long time. What did she want? For so long, survival had been the only goal. Pay rent, buy food, keep the lights on. She'd never had the luxury of wanting more. But now, with resources suddenly available, the question felt profound. What did Sarah Mitchell actually want? She started small. A new apartment, nothing fancy, but clean and safe, with good schools nearby for Emma. Furniture that wasn't secondhand or falling apart. Clothes that fit and weren't worn through. A car that didn't break down every other week. She paid off every debt she had, every medical bill, every credit card, every late notice. She paid Gerald back for all his expenses, despite his protests. She paid Monica for her work, tipped generously, donated to local charities that had helped her when she was struggling. And still, there was money left over. So much money. In April, the government quietly dropped their appeal. The official statement cited resource allocation priorities, but Gerald explained the truth. They'd done the political calculus and realized continuing the fight was costing them more in public goodwill than the assets were worth. Better to let Sarah keep the fortune and move on. Victor's lawsuit collapsed a week later when his own attorney withdrew from the case, citing insurmountable evidence problems. Volkov had apparently realized that Eleanor's will was unbreakable and that continuing to fight was just burning Victor's money for no gain. "It's over," Gerald told Sarah over the phone. "You won." Sarah sat in her new apartment, Emma at school, and tried to feel the victory. But mostly, she just felt exhausted. The fight had taken 6 months of her life, 6 months of stress and fear and uncertainty. She'd won, yes, but the cost had been steep. That evening, she drove to Eleanor's grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, spring flowers blooming along the pathways. She found the headstone easily, simple granite with Eleanor's name and dates. Sarah knelt beside it, running her fingers over the carved letters. "We won, Grandma," she whispered. "I kept what you wanted me to have. I fought for it. I didn't let them take it." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Sarah could almost hear Eleanor's voice, warm and proud. "I knew you could do it. I always believed in you." Tears rolled down Sarah's face, not from sadness, but from relief. She'd carried Eleanor's faith through the darkest moments, had clung to it when everything seemed impossible, and she'd proven worthy of that faith. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, "for everything. For raising me. For loving me. For trusting me with this. I'm going to use it well. I promise." She stayed there until the sun began to set, talking to Eleanor about Emma, about the future, about all the plans she was making. When she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd been carrying had finally lifted. Over the next year, Sarah's life transformed in ways she'd never imagined. More bearer bonds were redeemed. The gold was sold through proper channels, the jewelry appraised, and either sold or placed in secure storage. The final total, after all taxes and legal fees, was $142 million. Sarah established a trust for Emma's future, enough to pay for any college she wanted, to start any business she dreamed of, to live comfortably without the grinding poverty that had defined Sarah's life. She set up a foundation in Eleanor's name, focused on helping single mothers escape poverty, on providing legal aid, education assistance, and emergency funds. She bought a comfortable house, not a mansion, just a real home with a yard where Emma could play and rooms filled with light. She traveled, taking Emma to places they'd only seen in books, showing her daughter that the world was bigger and more beautiful than the small, desperate existence they'd known. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah went back to school. She'd always wanted to be a teacher, had dreamed of it before Marcus left, and reality crushed those dreams beneath bills and survival. Now, with financial security assured, she enrolled in a teaching program, determined to use her second chance to help others, the way Eleanor had helped her. Victor tried to contact her several times, his messages alternating between anger and false contrition, but Sarah never responded. Now, he'd made his choices. He'd shown who he truly was. And she owed him nothing, not even acknowledgement. The media occasionally still mentioned her story, usually as an example of ordinary people fighting powerful institutions and winning. Sarah gave a few interviews, carefully selected, always with the message that Eleanor had been the true hero, that family and love mattered more than money ever could. On a warm afternoon in late summer, 2 years after finding the facility, Sarah returned to the site one final time. Gerald had arranged for it to be properly closed and secured, the remaining classified documents returned to the government, the entrance sealed. It was just a hillside now, anonymous and quiet. Emma stood beside her, taller now, older, the shadow of trauma slowly fading from her eyes. Do you ever wish we hadn't found it?" Emma asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. The last 2 years had been difficult, transformative, exhausting, and exhilarating in equal measure. She'd been tested in ways she'd never imagined, had found strength she didn't know she possessed, had learned that fighting for what was right was always worth the cost. "No," she said finally. "I don't wish that. Your great-grandmother gave us a gift, not just the money, but the chance to prove we were stronger than anyone thought, including ourselves." Emma nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who'd lived through it could. They stood together for a few more minutes, then turned and walked back to the car. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at the hillside disappearing behind them. Somewhere beneath that innocent slope, a concrete facility sat empty and silent, its secrets extracted, its purpose served. It had been a tomb for forgotten wealth, and Eleanor had turned it into a legacy of hope. Sarah Mitchell had been a woman dismissed, mocked, and underestimated by nearly everyone who knew her. She'd been poor, desperate, and hanging on by her fingernails to a life that seemed determined to break her. But she'd also been brave. She'd been stubborn. And when Eleanor handed her a mystery wrapped in a music box, she'd had the courage to follow it wherever it led. The fortune had changed her life, yes, but the journey had changed her soul. It had shown her that she was capable of more than survival, that she deserved more than scraps, that the woman everyone had overlooked was actually someone worth remembering. And as she drove toward home, toward Emma, toward the future they'd built together from secrets and determination, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe what Eleanor had always known. She was enough. She'd always been enough. The world had just needed time to see it. 5 years had passed since the courthouse steps, since the cameras and the shouting, and the moment Judge Holloway's gavel had changed everything. Sarah stood now in the lobby of the Eleanor Mitchell Center for Family Advocacy, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as parents arrived for the evening's graduation ceremony. Single mothers, mostly, though a few fathers too, all of them completing the center's 6-month program in financial literacy, job training, and legal advocacy. The building itself had been Sarah's proudest achievement. Not the most expensive thing she'd funded, not even close, but the one that meant the most. 3 stories of renovated brick in a neighborhood that had been forgotten by the city's prosperity, transformed into classrooms, computer labs, childcare facilities, and counseling offices. Eleanor's picture hung in the main hall, taken during her government service days, young and serious and full of purpose. Sarah touched the small music box pendant hanging around her neck, a miniature replica crafted from gold that had once sat in that underground facility. She wore it every day, a reminder of where she'd come from and why she couldn't stop moving forward. "Mom, they're starting to arrive," Emma called from across the lobby. 14 now, poised and confident in ways that sometimes took Sarah's breath away. Emma had grown into her experience. I had taken the trauma of those chaotic months and forged it into strength. She volunteered at the center every weekend, tutored younger children, spoke at fundraising events with an eloquence that made donors reach for their checkbooks. Sarah joined her daughter at the welcome table, where they'd laid out programs and name tags. The first graduate arrived, a woman named Teresa, whose story Sarah knew by heart. Fled domestic violence with 3 children, arrived at the center with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a court date she couldn't afford a lawyer for. The center had provided everything: emergency housing, legal representation, job training, child care, while she studied for her nursing assistant certification. "Ms. Mitchell," Teresa said, her eyes bright with tears, "I don't know how to thank you." Sarah took her hands, or you already have, by being here, by not giving up, by showing your children what strength looks like. Teresa moved on to find her seat, and Sarah watched her go, feeling the familiar swell of purpose that had replaced the desperate survival instinct she'd carried for so many years. This was what the fortune was for, not mansions or yachts or the trappings of wealth that meant nothing. These women, these children, these second chances. The ceremony began at 7. Sarah gave the opening remarks, speaking about Eleanor, about the unexpected inheritance that had changed her life, about the responsibility that came with resources. She talked about how her grandmother had worked in the shadows of history, keeping secrets that were never hers to tell, and how in the end, Eleanor had chosen love over loyalty to institutions that had forgotten her the moment she retired. "My grandmother believed in the power of one person to change a trajectory," Sarah said, looking out at the 100 faces filling the auditorium. She believed that given the right tools, the right support, the right chance, anyone could transform their life. This center exists because she took a risk on me. And now, we take that same risk on you. Not because we think you need saving, but because we know you're already saving yourselves. We're just here to make sure you have what you need to finish the job." The applause was thunderous. Sarah stepped back, letting Emma take the microphone to introduce the keynote speaker, a state senator who had once been homeless and now championed legislation protecting vulnerable families. Sarah slipped backstage, needing a moment alone. The past 5 years had been a whirlwind of learning and growth. She'd finished her teaching degree, though she'd never taken a traditional classroom job. Instead, she taught here at the center, working with adults who'd been told they were too old, too damaged, too far behind to ever catch up. She proved them wrong 3 times a week, watching people discover talents they'd never known they had. The money had changed everything and nothing. She still lived modestly by billionaire standards. Her house was comfortable but not ostentatious. She drove a reliable car, not a luxury vehicle. She dressed well, but not extravagantly. The bulk of the fortune sat in trusts and foundations, working capital that generated returns, which funded the center and a dozen other programs across the country. She'd become, almost accidentally, a voice in national conversations about poverty, about the structural barriers that kept people trapped in cycles of desperation. She'd testified before Congress twice, had been featured in documentaries, had written a book about her experience, that had somehow become a bestseller. The royalties all went to the foundation. But she'd also learned to say no. No to the endless interview requests, the speaking engagements, the people who wanted to attach themselves to her story for their own gain. She'd learned that wealth attracted parasites as surely as it attracted genuine allies, and that discerning between the two required constant vigilance. Victor had tried to contact her again about 3 years ago, not through lawyers this time, but through a handwritten letter delivered to the center. In it, he'd apologized, or what passed for an apology in his vocabulary. He acknowledged he'd been hasty and perhaps overly emotional in his response to Eleanor's will. He suggested they move past old grievances and remember they were family. The letter had made Sarah laugh, a bitter sound that startled Emma, who'd been in the room at the time. Victor wanted access to the fortune he'd tried so hard to steal. He'd burned through most of his own wealth in bad investments and expensive lawsuits. And now he needed Sarah's help. She'd written back. One sentence. Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing when she left me that music box. I suggest you respect her judgment. She'd never heard from him again. The ceremony continued in the auditorium, voices rising in celebration as each graduate crossed the stage to receive their certificate. Sarah returned to watch, standing at the back with Gerald, who had become not just her lawyer, but a trusted friend and board member of the foundation. 7 more centers opening next year, Gerald said quietly, reviewing something on his tablet. Atlanta, Detroit, Phoenix, Seattle, Boston, Miami, and Houston. That'll bring the total to 15 nationwide. Can we sustain that rate of expansion? The endowment is generating more returns than we can spend. The bond redemptions that are still processing will add another $40 million over the next 2 years. Yes, we can sustain it. The question is whether we can find qualified directors to run them all. Sarah had learned that money wasn't the limiting factor in doing good. Finding trustworthy, capable, passionate people to execute the vision was far more difficult. She'd made mistakes in the early years, had trusted the wrong people with leadership positions, had watched as incompetence or corruption undermined programs she'd poured her heart into. Each failure had taught her to be more careful, more demanding, more willing to fire people who couldn't meet the standard Eleanor's name deserved. After the ceremony, Sarah stayed for the reception, mingling with graduates and their families, accepting hugs and tears and gratitude that still felt undeserved, even after all these years. A young mother named Jamila approached with her 2-year-old son on her hip. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted you to know I start my job Monday. Paralegal at a downtown firm. Benefits, salary, everything. 2 years ago I was sleeping in my car. Her voice broke. I don't know how to explain what this place has done for me." Sarah looked at the little boy, his eyes wide and curious, and thought about Emma at that age, thought about all the nights she'd held her daughter, and wondered if they'd make it through another month. "You don't have to explain," Sarah said gently. "Just pay it forward. Someday, when you're stable and successful, remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to need help. And when you have the chance to give someone else a hand up, take it." Jamila nodded, tears streaming down her face, and moved on into the celebration. Emma found Sarah an hour later, as the crowd was thinning. "There's someone here who wants to meet you. Says she worked with great-grandma Eleanor during the war." Sarah's heart skipped. "On where?" Emma led her to a quiet corner where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, her frame frail but her eyes sharp and alert. She looked to be in her 90s, dressed carefully in a navy suit that had seen better days, but was impeccably maintained. "Mrs. Mitchell," the woman said, her voice thin but clear. "My name is Margaret Lawson. I worked with your grandmother from 1959 to 1963. I heard about your center, about what you've accomplished with what Eleanor left you. I had to come." Sarah pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with the woman. "You knew my grandmother?" "We shared an office," Margaret said, a smile crossing her aged face. "Both of us were glorified secretaries, though they called us administrative specialists. We typed classified documents we weren't supposed to read, but couldn't help reading. We filed reports about things that officially never happened. And we kept each other sane when the weight of all those secrets got too heavy." "She never talked about her work," Sarah said softly. "I knew she'd been with the government, but not the details." "She couldn't," Margaret replied. "None of us could. We signed papers, took oaths, but Eleanor always struggled with it more than the rest of us. She had a conscience that wouldn't quit." The old woman's eyes grew distant. "I remember the day she found out about Facility 7. We weren't supposed to know it existed, but Eleanor accidentally saw a file she shouldn't have. Project Nightingale. All those assets, just sitting there, buried and forgotten, while people starved during the recessions." Sarah leaned forward. "She told you about it?" "She told me everything. We were friends, our real friends, the kind you only make when you're both drowning in the same secrets. She was horrified. All that wealth, hidden away for an emergency that never came, while the government cut social programs and told people there was no money to help them. She wanted to expose it, but I talked her out of it. Told her she'd go to prison, that they'd destroy her. So she kept quiet, kept the secret for 60 years. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached into a small purse on her lap. "But she never forgot. About 10 years ago she called me, said she was getting older, that her granddaughter was struggling, and that she'd made a decision. She was going to leave you the clues. Said if anyone deserved that fortune, it was someone who understood what it meant to have nothing." She pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "She gave me this. Told me to find you, if anything happened to her. I've been looking for 3 years, since I heard about her passing. I'm not as mobile as I used to be, and it took time. But when I saw your center in the news, I knew I'd found the right Sarah Mitchell." Sarah took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in Eleanor's handwriting, dated 8 years earlier. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've found what I left for you, and my friend Margaret has found you. I want you to know that leaving you those clues was the hardest decision I've ever made, because I knew it would put you in danger, would expose you to forces you weren't prepared to fight. But I also knew that you were stronger than you believed. I watched you survive your parents' death. I watched you survive a terrible marriage. I watched you raise Emma alone, work yourself to exhaustion, and still find the strength to be kind, to be hopeful, to be good. The government buried that wealth because they were afraid. Afraid of questions, afraid of accountability, afraid of what would happen if people knew the truth about how resources were managed during the Cold War. But fear is a poor reason to hide what could help millions. I spent 60 years being afraid, afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge the institutions I had served, afraid of the consequences of doing what was right instead of what was expected. I don't want you to live that way. I don't want Emma to grow up believing that fear should dictate her choices. So I'm giving you something I never gave myself, the chance to be brave, the chance to fight for what you deserve, the chance to use wealth not for personal comfort, but for the kind of change that ripples outward and touches lives you'll never know. You're going to doubt yourself. You're going to be afraid. People are going to tell you that you're not smart enough, not strong enough, not worthy of what you've found. Don't believe them. You are all of those things and more. I love you, Sarah. I always have. I always will. And I believe in you more than I've ever believed in anything. Use the fortune well. Be the person I always knew you could be. With all my love, Grandma Eleanor Sarah couldn't see the words anymore through her tears. Emma knelt beside her, reading over her shoulder, and Sarah felt her daughter's arms wrap around her shoulders. She knew, Emma whispered. She knew how strong you were all along. Sarah folded the letter carefully and looked at Margaret. Thank you for keeping this, for finding me. Margaret smiled. Eleanor was the best friend I ever had. I promised her I'd make sure you knew she believed in you. Promise kept. She paused, then added, what you've done with the fortune, the center, all of it, she would be so proud. I'm proud, and I barely know you. They talked for another hour, Margaret sharing stories about Eleanor's younger days, about the woman Sarah had loved but never fully known, the government worker who'd questioned authority even when it was dangerous, the secret keeper who'd hated secrets, the patriot who'd loved her country enough to challenge it. When Margaret finally left, wheeled out by a care aide, and Sarah stood in the empty lobby of the center and felt the weight of Eleanor's legacy settle more comfortably on her shoulders. For years, she'd carried the fortune like a burden, like something she hadn't earned and didn't deserve. But Eleanor's letter reframed everything. This wasn't about deserving. It was about trust. Eleanor had trusted her to do something meaningful with wealth that had sat useless for 6 decades. And Sarah had honored that trust, had transformed it into something that changed lives every single day. Emma stood beside her, looking up at Eleanor's portrait on the wall. Do you think she can see what we've done? Sarah considered the question seriously. I don't know if the dead can see the living, but I know that what we've built here, it's what she wanted. Maybe not the specific details, but the spirit of it, for taking what was hidden and using it to help people. That's what she believed in. They drove home together through quiet streets, the city lights reflecting off recent rain. Their house was dark when they arrived, but warm light spilled from the windows as Sarah unlocked the door. Inside, the life they'd built together was evident in every corner. Emma's artwork on the walls, graduation certificates from Sarah's teaching program framed in the hallway, photographs of center openings and celebrations scattered across the mantel. This was home. Real, earned, built on a foundation of loss and discovery, and the stubborn determination to be better than circumstances demanded. Sarah made tea, while Emma finished homework at the kitchen table. The music box pendant clinked softly against the counter as Sarah moved, a gentle reminder of everything that had changed since that rainy funeral day 5 years ago. She'd been someone different then, desperate, defeated, barely hanging on. The woman she was now bore little resemblance to that scared single mother who'd stood in Eleanor's parlor and accepted a music box as her entire inheritance. But in some ways, she was exactly the same. Still fighting, still determined, still refusing to let the world tell her she was less than she knew herself to be. Mom, Emma said, looking up from her math homework. When I'm older, I want to run one of the centers. Not because you want me to, but because I want to. Is that okay? Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. More than okay, but you don't have to decide that now. You have time to figure out who you want to be. I know, Emma said. Mom, but I've been thinking about it. Great-Grandma Eleanor gave us something amazing. Not just money, but purpose. I don't want to waste that. I want to help people the way you've been helping people. Sarah crossed the kitchen and pulled her daughter into a hug. Then you will, and you'll be incredible at it. They stood together in the warm kitchen, the past and the future woven into a single moment of peace. Outside, the world continued its chaotic spin. Inside, Sarah Mitchell held her daughter and felt the weight of Eleanor's belief settle into certainty. She had been enough. She would continue to be enough. And the music box that had started everything sat safely in a display case in the center's lobby, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gifts contain the largest possibilities. The fortune had been substantial, but Eleanor's real gift had been faith. Faith that Sarah would find what was hidden. Faith that she would fight for it. Faith that she would use it well. And every day, in every life touched by the center, Sarah proved that faith had been justified. Eleanor Mitchell's granddaughter had taken a secret buried in darkness and transformed it into light that spread farther than any of them had ever imagined possible. And she was just getting started. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.